Welcome to History Hack. If you didn't know by now, we are the revolution. That means we're sharp, witty, lots of fun, but it also means that we're essentially the peasants in Les Mis huddled round a table in the corner of the bar with no money. If you enjoy the show, please do support us. We have a Patreon account by which you can donate a small monthly sum in appreciation of what you're hearing. Alternatively, we have Ko-fi, in which you can just do a one-off donation as a thank you if you particularly enjoy a certain episode. Either way, we massively appreciate all of your support. Hope you enjoy the show. Hello and welcome to today's History Hack. We've got a bit of a sweeping episode for everybody today, haven't we, Chris?
Yeah, absolutely. This was sent to me about 3 months ago. I think I got the first copy, and it's really good. Got Ferdinand Mount, who is a writer and former head of the Downing Street political unit and editor of the Times literary supplement for 11 years. And he's here today to talk to us about his new book, Big Caesars and Little Caesars, How They Rise and How They Fall, from Julius Caesar to Boris Johnson. Ferdinand, welcome to History Hack. How are you doing?
Not too bad. Thanks very much for inviting me.
I really love this concept of looking at it from when a Caesar actually was a Caesar, all the way down through to people who have absolute delusions of grandeur and should know better. I think that's a really good concept for a book.
Well, of course, from the start, the Romans were very suspicious of the first Caesars, and Marcus Aurelius, the second center, said in his Meditations, "At all costs, I must remember not to become Caesarified." So it goes back a long way back, the idea that this is some dangerous temptation. But really, what I'm talking about, the idea of Caesarism, starts in the 19th century when people suddenly reacted against parliamentary democracy and what they thought were its failings, and all the fiddling with ballots and majorities and governments changing. And all the philosophers hated that. Hegel, Marx, a lot of them, they all hated this idea that people could discuss and change their minds and argue, and that the votes could move this way and that. And that's when the word Caesarism came in, and when Louis Napoleon became a French Caesar. And Karl Marx said, you know the famous remark, when something happens the first time, they forgot to add that the second time it happens as farce. They thought that Caesarism was a throwback, wasn't going to happen in our day. But here we are, 150 years later, and there are Caesars wherever you like to look, really.
Yeah, I think there's always someone who just doesn't want to play nice with everybody else in the sandbox and just wants everyone to do what they want. I don't think that's ever going to go away, do you?
No, I don't, but I think the illusion was that it had gone away, that we got nice, secure parliamentary democracy that was going to be conquer everywhere. This character, Frank Fukuyama, wrote a famous book called The End of History, which said no more Caesars, no more dictators. The latest study of Caesars, dictators, whatever you want to call them, by Ian Dale, who I think is not unknown to you, he says that almost half the Caesars in recorded history are since Mr. Fukuyama wrote his book saying it was dead and gone. So here we are. We're stuck with them. But the good thing is, of course, we can get rid of them. And Bolsonaro, Trump, our own dear Boris, they can be toppled. So my book isn't a pessimistic one. It's a hymn to vigilance. It's saying this is how they work, and this is how you can get rid of them.
I was just going to say, I actually am going to be writing for that dictators book as well, which I think I have to hand it in this year for next year, because
I think it's next year. Yes, yeah.
Yeah, I have Ataturk. I don't know if you're contributing as well.
Oh, right. No, well, I'm not. No, but it is a fascinating thing, and thing is, they don't need to have any ideology or policy particularly, except a rather sort of shouty nationalism and whipping up hostility to immigrants. And that goes back, way back, that particular theme to Pericles was in ancient Greece, a figure much admired by Boris. He introduced a law saying no one who was an immigrant could become a citizen, and his own wife got stuffed by that law because she turned out to be half foreign. But so that is a very ancient theme, which doesn't stop it being played over and over again.
Yeah, and the one that you use as to illustrate the idea of Caesarism is a history hack favourite, Oliver Cromwell.
Yes, well, Oliver Cromwell. It's the most extraordinary thing. You go into Parliament Square and you see this lovely great statue by a very good sculptor of the late 19th century, Amo Thornycroft. And there he is, looking all like a sort of nightclub bouncer in armor. And what's he doing in front of the Mother of Parliaments? Because Oliver Cromwell smashed up not only the famous scene when he walked in and said, "You are no Parliament, get out," and took up the mace and ran off with it, but he smashed up Parliament after Parliament 6 times. And yet there he is in glorified in front of the House of Commons. And but it took a very long time because he was cursed for centuries until Thomas Carlyle said, what we need is heroes. He read a book called On Heroes and Hero Worship. And he said, what we need is great men. Put a great man in charge, forget all the ballots and elections and so on. Put a great man in charge and you're fine. Napoleon, Cromwell, nothing will go wrong when you, if you do that. And he persuaded a whole generation that Cromwell was a great parliamentarian. So there are these wonderful posthumous hagiographies which completely distort the history of what the person actually did. The same is true of Napoleon, who smashed up 3 French assemblies. And indeed, when Napoleon came into the French Assembly, which was meeting out at Saint-Cloud, a lot of the indignant deputies shouted, "À bas Cromwell." I mean, they recognized that here was another Cromwell. But that doesn't stop them.
No, it doesn't. I think here's what my nan would have called a shitbag, for want of a better term. Especially you mentioned him to Irish people, and they most certainly would not agree that he deserves a statue outside Parliament.
Yeah, that actually it was the Irish MPs. Lord Rosebery, for some weird reason, thought Cromwell was wonderful, and he tried to get Parliament to vote money for it. And so, but he'd forgotten about the large block of Irish MPs who said, for God's sake, remember Drogheda, remember Wexford, the massacres at Cromwell. So they threw it out. So he had to pay for it himself, or rather he had to pay for it out of his wife's money. So it's a peculiar thing that it should be standing there.
I do like as well, there is a way to punk people, I think, with the statues, because if you've seen the one of Lloyd George that sits in Parliament Square, if that isn't an insult to the man, I don't know what is, because it's horrible and it makes me laugh every time I see it, because it's like a very ugly Lego man. And I think that the sculptor did that on purpose.
I know. But it's the techniques by which you get there are pretty much the same.
Yeah, because there are quite a lot of similarities between how these individuals come to power and how they act as well, isn't there?
There are, certainly. And hostility to immigrants, which I've already mentioned, is the absolute standard one. I mean, it's people we regard as good leaders may resort to that too. I mean, Queen Elizabeth, good Queen Bess, said there were too many blackamoors in this country. And that they needed to be chucked out. So, I mean, it's not a new thing, but it is being emphasized and pushed with really quite remarkable zest in the modern world. And Donald Trump and the Mexicans. Of course, in America, a nation of immigrants, the enemy within, or the enemy at the gates, changes from generation to generation. In the 19th century, it was Italian immigrants whose terrible papists, garlic-eating papists who were going to swamp the Protestants, they were the enemy. And then of course, it was the blacks from the south, and now it's the Mexicans. But the cynicism with which these things are pushed remains the same as it in Britain now. The anti-immigrant thing is pushed entirely in terms of boat people, when, as everyone knows, 3/4 of the people in the immigrant statistics are either care workers working in the hospitality sector or foreign students, and the boat people are a tiny proportion, but that never stops people. But I think Boris is quite remarkable in the ways he uses not several more of the traditional enemy Aunt Sallies of the Caesar. Judges, he's gone for lefty lawyers who are obstructing the will of the people, and then fake voters. We've now got compulsory ID to reduce the number of people who might vote Labour, on the entirely fraudulent premise that there's a great deal of voter impersonation, which is virtually invisible problem. And then actually Parliament itself became Boris's target. He says, "You are a broken Parliament." Words which very much remind one of Cromwell, or you may think the two people have very little in common, but that idea that Parliament was obstructing the will of the people is common to them both. And then, of course, demonstrators. This government, like the Johnson government, was passing laws to restrict the right to demonstrate, and now the police have the power to forbid demonstrations which they think are too noisy. Well, I mean, who's to say what's too noisy? And demonstration which makes no noise at all is inaudible. And that, I think, is people perhaps may not have put it all together, but if you put the record of the Johnson government over its 3 years and the acts which became law in the spring of last year, April 22, the 5 acts, they are a remarkable set of repressive laws. And we used to learn at school about the repressive 6 acts, which Lord Liverpool's government brought in after Waterloo. But Johnson's 5 acts have a rather family similarity to that. But again, all this is standard Caesarist technique.
You have already mentioned one man who has a debatable relationship with the truth. Actually, this was in the papers just yesterday because he was waffling and just making words up, and that's Donald Trump. So how is truth manipulated across history between these Caesars? Who could you pick out for us that shares those parallels?
Well, I think you can go right back to the start. Again, we were taught, remember, if we taught Latin at school, we were taught that Caesar's account of the war, his Gallic campaign, was an absolute model of war reporting. And for 2,000 years, everyone thought it was the absolute truth. But now historians say he made 2/3 of it up, exaggerated the casualties of the Gauls. And if you look at it, every now and then he says he wiped out a tribe, and then the tribe reappears in the next chapter to be wiped out again. It's all tremendously overblown reporting. But the interesting thing is that people at the time say, hey, he's made a lot of this up. The general Asinius Pollio, who was he was a friend of Caesar's, and he was with Caesar when Caesar crossed the Rubicon. He said he'd made a lot of it up and exaggerated, but he got away with it, and so did Napoleon, whose bulletins from the battlefront were so notorious for their untruthfulness, that the expression to lie like a bulletin became a sort of cliche in France. And so lying is a standard technique, and the philosophers, political philosophers, have often approved it. Plato invented the idea of the noble lie, that it was permissible to tell a lie in the interests of the state. Well, of course, who defines what the interest of the state is? And Machiavelli said, no, nobody is going anywhere in politics can afford to tell the truth all the time. The truth is for wimps. And the little people, great men, are unashamed to lie. There's a very good dystopian novel by Sinclair Lewis called It Can't Happen Here, published in the 30s, which said pretty much that it has a sort of fictional dictator who said the truth isn't for plain folks. It would just only confuse them. And everyone said at the time they thought it was like particularly unscrupulous populist Governor Huey Long. But actually, when Donald Trump came along, said, 50 years later, here's somebody who fulfills exactly this idea that the truth is for little people and what we need is alternative facts. On Trump's most famous lie, that he won the election, in which he propelled all that. But the thing that he'd actually said this 8 years before, and nobody much noticed because he was only a loudmouth businessman at the time. But when Obama was re-elected in 2012, Trump tweeted like crazy, "We can't let this happen," he said. "We need a revolution. This is a lie. Obama lost." And he then rather hurriedly deleted the tweets, so that you had to be a rather vigilant reporter like Peter Oborne, who I picked this little tidbit up from. But he'd been denying election results for the past decade. And of course, the one thing that parliamentary democracy or any kind of democracy requires is losers' consent. You have to, if you lose, you've got to say, "I'm sorry, we lost. People made a mistake, but we lost." As soon as you refuse to do that, you're in big trouble. So the refusal to accept plain facts is, or to report things accurately. I mean, as we all know, Boris came to fame as Brussels correspondent for the Daily Telegraph, where he propelled all these wonderful fantasies about the things that the Brussels bureaucrats were going to do. And this sort of curious way that people accept these things as a sort of half joke. Actually, Trump himself had a rather good phrase for it. He called it truthful hyperbole, i.e., if you say something which is sort of exaggerated and amusing, the fact that it isn't actually true is sort of secondary.
It kind of reinforces people's beliefs anyway. You know, you've got the people who believe that Brussels are going to bring in straight bananas and they're going to make our hoovers less powerful. So when you get someone say, "Oh yeah, this is what's happening," they go, "Oh yeah, we knew it. So
yeah, absolutely right. It's the sort of thing they would do. It reinforces your existing beliefs.
I know we've kind of touched on this already, but the and I'm trying not to mention a popular mid-20th century German regime, but in the rise of certain dictators, they do tend to use the enemies of the people and them and us, in inverted commas, to raise to power. That's quite a popular move, isn't it?
Yes. I mean, I think you have to refer to a certain mid-20th century German politician, because the similarities are so great, not only with the modern right-wing dictators, but with left-wing dictators, and indeed with the teachings of Karl Marx. I mean, Mein Kampf is filled with these descriptions of the young Adolf going to the Austrian parliament and thinking these old wafflers are no good at all, and that parliamentary democracy is a completely broken system and it must be swept away. And it really isn't very different from the Marxist view of bourgeois democracy. And of course, the indifference to truth is one of the most important parts of Mein Kampf. And if you the interesting thing in Mein Kampf is that the one thing that Hitler admires very much about the British or the Allies was their propaganda in the First World War, that they'd made, he said, invented a whole lot of German atrocities. And he said, the thing is, you've got to do better than that. You've got to do better than they do. You've got to invent your own atrocities. And so the passages in Mein Kampf on propaganda are, I would say, remain the most influential part of that terrible book, because in return, the democratic regimes took up propaganda in a big way, and deception and perpetual bombarding of the public with the same message over and over again. And when you read about the modern information departments of presidents and prime ministers, comms, as we call them now, not even communications, the orthodoxy is you've got to pump the stuff out 24/7. You've got to go on saying the same simple thing over and over again until people believe it. And that is the legacy of Mein Kampf, which has infected politics everywhere, I think.
Yeah, wasn't it Goebbels who said something about perpetuating the big lie to the people? Yeah, I forget the complete quote.
That is key, I think. And I got a chapter, one of the chapters about coups that fail, because I think it's quite important to see when coup d'états fail and why they fail. And one of them that I chose is the beer hall putsch, in which in the end the legitimate authorities in Bavaria stood firm and locked them up, and there was a shootout in which a dozen or so of the Nazis were killed. But what was interesting was that Hitler already thought, actually, I don't really want to be doing this, because I'd much rather get myself elected more or less legitimacy and then abolish the parliamentary democracy, which is what he did very quickly and effectively in 1933. So he sort of thought, in a way, he was on a loser, although he said that the people who were killed were martyrs of the revolution. But he was already on a winning wicket, because even the people he was trying to lock up were themselves meditating a coup against Berlin. And the whole atmosphere of Bavaria after the end of after the armistice was so infected with vengefulness, anti-Semitism, hostility to democracy, and all the other things that Hitler had a huge groundswell of popular opinion behind him. If the authorities hadn't stood firm, he might well have made it then. But the other thing to note is how remarkably stable and cohesive the Nazi Party was, even at that early stage, 10 years before taking power and 22 years before they were all lined up in the dock at Nuremberg. They were all there, Goebbels, Goering, the whole lot of them, and they stuck together in an extremely effective way. So although the coup failed, it's interesting to see the sort of how the makings of the Nazi regime was already fully in place, with a full program of all the horrible things that they did in the end do.
It's horrific, isn't it? I just want to quickly duck back, because you did mention the case of Oliver Cromwell and how a historian had inadvertently or advertently stirred up this kind of cult of personality to give this person a reputation in history for people, and then it might skew our view of them and what they did. Is that exclusive to Cromwell, or do you find that occurring multiple times?
Multiple times, I think. For example, the first use of the term Caesarism, as in French, this interesting but weirdo Auguste Romier, who wrote a book called The Era of Caesarism, looking back to Napoleon the First, and promoting the cult of Louis Napoleon, Napoleon's nephew, and he completely repeated all the accusations against Parliament, and he bigged up Louis Napoleon, and Victor Hugo said, after Napoleon the Great, we have Napoleon le Petit. But Romier managed to get people to believe that Louis Napoleon was in fact great. And you get that, and that reverberates on to de Gaulle 100 years later. De Gaulle's reputation was much enhanced by his Lieutenant Philippe Séguin, who led the Gaullist party. And Séguin wrote a book called Napoleon the Great about Louis Napoleon. So they were kind of establishing a tradition that these people who smash up parliaments, Louis Napoleon locked up the judges and the MPs, and killed a few hundred people as well. So he wasn't a sort of softy. And they established a tradition that these people who destroy elected parliaments do in fact represent the will of the people. So you need to have these enthusiastic propagandists. But of course, the big Caesars and little Caesars are often their own best propagandists, but they need a few little helpers to pull them along.
A lot of the Caesars that we've talked about so far in the book are men. No comments on that. But there you do mention one female Caesar. So can you tell us a bit about Indira Gandhi?
Yes, I think the reason they're all men is because women haven't very often been allowed to get near the top. But Indira Gandhi was, after all, only got to the top because she was Nehru's daughter. And when they made her head of the Congress Party, they thought the sort of the godfathers of the Congress Party thought that she would be an easy touch because she was only a silly girl and she hadn't really got any political experience. However, she turned out to be a great deal tougher than they were, and abolished the Congress Party as it was and restarted it. And then it took everyone by surprise. It especially took English politicians like Michael Foot and Margaret Thatcher, who very much admired her as a democratically elected prime minister. And so they thought, when she brought in the emergency in 1975, there must be a good reason for it. And they were very indulgent towards her, although the fact that, you know, she put 100,000 people in jail, censored the press, and removed provincial prime ministers who wouldn't kowtow to her. and altogether had a perfectly straightforward Caesarist program, not as murderous as some, but one that did lasting damage, because she did, to a lot of people's equal surprise, then repent after a couple of years and held an election which she lost very badly. And she got back again later, which was equally surprising. But the fact that she'd been able to impose the emergency on the Indian public with virtually no resistance was a very bad example, and to her successors. And Narendra Modi is well aware, having studied Mrs. Gandhi's record, that the Indian people will put up with quite a lot of this stuff. So it's interesting, although he's of a different party, a different persuasion, he never criticizes Mrs. Gandhi because she taught him the way to do it. So I think one thing to sort of temper any optimism one may have when one of these Caesars gets toppled is that the damage left behind can last a long time. I mean, in the first place, in broken relations with other countries, we're still picking up the pieces in this country, the fallout from Brexit, but also in the way in which laws have been twisted or broken, and institutions have been belittled or perverted. You know, you have to fight back against this. Too late for my book, but a very good, interesting episode, I think, was the report of the Privileges Committee, which recommended a substantial suspension from Parliament for Mr. Johnson, at which he slunk off into the bushes as what's it called, the Chiltern Hundreds, that word privilege, which is on the whole a word which is used rather pejoratively, but when the Privileges Committee reported, I thought back to a royal Caesar, who, you remember, Charles I, when he came to Parliament to try and arrest those MPs, and the Speaker said, I can't tell you where they are. And he said, damn it, the birds have flown, and went off. But he then tried, in a sort of sequel to this famous episode, he heard that they'd gone by boat down the Thames to the City of London, take refuge there. So he marched off with his troops down the Strand. And he was, I didn't really believe it when I first read it, he was met by huge crowds of protesters shouting "privileges of Parliament," which is an awfully cumbersome mouthful to shout as a slogan. But there was a popular feeling that Parliament should be privileged in the sense that it should be able to freely debate without the threat of armed soldiers coming in and arresting its members. And so that word privilege crops up now, however much longer, 3.5 centuries later, that Parliament, as long as Parliament is doing its job, it has its right to insist on its privileges. So there was a sort of telling little parallel, I thought.
Definitely. Have to ask, how does the gunpowder plot fit into all of this?
The gunpowder plot, well, that's like another one I chose, the Cato Street conspiracy, is an example of conspiracies, coup d'etat, which in theory had a chance, but in practice were rumbled before they started, so that while Guy Fawkes was laying his gunpowder under the Houses of Parliament, the King's officers were already searching and found him, Mr. Guido Fawkes, in a slouch hat, piling up these huge barrels of gunpowder, which would indeed have been enough to blow the Houses of Parliament sky high. But a letter, a warning, nobody quite knows who sent this letter, but a letter warning that this was going to happen was brought to Lord Salisbury and the fellow cabinet of the day, and they acted very swiftly. And that's one thing that's interesting, is if the authorities act swiftly against an unjust coup which has no widespread support, they can pretty well snuff it out. And the gunpowder plotters who weren't arrested under the Houses of Parliament fled to the Midlands, to Warwickshire, Northamptonshire, Warwickshire, and eventually Staffordshire, hoping that they were going to pick up support. But they didn't pick up any support. In fact, their numbers dwindled as they got further and further to the house owned by the Littletons up in Staffordshire, and the Littletons were hanged and executed. One of them was called Humphrey Littleton, who's an ancestor of the trumpeter. So they just didn't have the backing, because they were mostly Catholic noblemen. And although the persecution of the Catholics was extremely harsh and persisting, they didn't have the popular support they needed. So that is one example of how energetic action can prevent something which you might have thought would have succeeded. Another example I use is the Catalan conspiracy. Catalan was a sort of talented, lively rogue who had quite a following among dashing young men, and he might have he got an army together of 20,000 men to march on Rome, but he was outflanked by Cicero, who staged a cunning sting so that his allies were all arrested. But history has sort of written him off as a kind of losers. But actually, the Roman historian Salazar said that he had great support among the populace, and if he hadn't screwed up, he might well have been as successful as Julius Caesar. So, I mean, these things are touch and go often, and depend on the diligence and the energy of public officials. I think one of the most interesting things about the whole aftermath of the Trump non-election was the election officials in Georgia and Arizona who just refused to be bullied and said, no, you didn't win. And a lot of them got punished by their Trumpista voters. Rusty Bowers, the speaker in Arizona, got chucked out by the Trump supporters for telling Trump and Rudy Giuliani, no, you lost, and we're not going to fiddle with it. So you depend on the diligence and honesty of public officials to keep the country safe.
So just finally, then, what goes up has to come down, especially if you happen to be a lunatic with a dubious grip on the truth. You get rumbled in the end. What are the parallels in terms of what brings these people down?
Well, what brings people down are, one way or another, they can get voted out if they haven't abolished elections. And if they have abolished elections, then in the end you have a revolution or a counter-revolution or whatever you want to think. But of course, they're also subject to all the weaknesses that flesh is heir to. They get ill. They quarrel with their supporters. But you know, some of them last a hell of a long time. I mean, a less flashy example is Salazar in Portugal, who never fought a battle. He was an academic economist, and he remained leader of Portugal for over 30 years. And it was a brutal regime, but not the most brutal. But there'd been so much upheaval, so many civil wars and rebellions and economic collapses beforehand, that the Portuguese were happy for a quiet life for that very long period of time. So they may get toppled, but they don't necessarily get toppled quickly. And Erdogan in Turkey is another very good example. You might think that he'd just be on the slide, but no, back he comes, gets re-elected. You know, not by a very large margin, but by enough. And I don't think he'll get any nicer. But you know, they can have a long life,
unless they invade Russia.
Unless they invade Russia. No, there are one or two. We could together put together a short handbook for would-be Caesars with about 6 rules, of which the first would be don't invade Russia, I think.
Yeah, but just that'll do. Just that as a page.
Yeah, it's self-explanatory. Just don't invade Russia. And then there's that nice cartoon. There's that cartoon that came out during the war of Napoleon stood staring at Moscow, and behind him was a monkey that looked like Hitler, and just posed, "Don't invade Russia," and then just that cartoon, and that explains it all.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, no, and of course, with all these things that go wrong, there's always the defenders of the Caesar who say, well, it was just a bit mismanaged. If we'd, you know, come from the north or something, it would probably have worked. Like communism would work, it just wasn't done properly. Brexit would be a huge success if it hadn't been messed up. So there's always rationalizations for failure.
And it comes down to the thems as well with well, you know, like Brexit, if the Remainers hadn't have scuppered.
Oh yeah, they screwed it up. Yeah, they made it impossible. Exactly.
You know, like the Treaty of Versailles, like we were stabbed in the back, sort of thing. And it's not our fault. We didn't mess it up.
We didn't lose. No.
Yeah.
It's another reoccurring theme, isn't it? That they do, like, for all of their craziness and the rubbish they're coming out with, inspire fanatical support.
Yes. It is, and that, of course, you know, all we smartasses then really retreat baffled because we can't understand it. I mean, it was a good one last weekend of Trump at some conference of Christian conservatives, and delegate after delegate was interviewed, and they all said, well, you know, I always vote for Trump. He's a good Christian gentleman, and if anything that would stop me voting for him is if he said he didn't believe in God, but otherwise I shall go on. So, you know, if that's your attitude to the life story of Donald J. Trump, well, there's no hope.
No, I think crazy does tend to find crazy, as Twitter has proved time and time again.
Yeah.
So I think we've covered around about 3,000 years of history.
Oh yes, at least, yes.
It's been really interesting, especially that we're drawing all these parallels. But would you mind just reminding everyone the title of your book and when it's out?
It's called Big Caesars and Little Caesars, How They Rise and How They Fall, from Julius Caesar to Boris Johnson. And it's out from the Great House of Bloomsbury on July the 20th.
Wow.
Well, best of luck with it. We will put it in the Great War Group bookshop so that people can get hold of it nice and easily via a link. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks so much, Alex. Been great fun. Thank you.
Our incredible guests give us 45 minutes of their time to join us and talk about their work or their new book. This is just a small taster. As a result, we have launched our very own bookshop on bookshop.org, where you can find our guests' latest books, you can support them, and you can support us on History Hack. 10% of every sale via our bookshop supports the podcast and allows us to keep going and bring you more top-of-the-line guests. You can find our bookshop at bookshop.org/shop/History Hack, or search for us in the shop section. Thank you so much for your continued support. We really appreciate our listeners and supporters. So make sure you get down to the bookshop and grab yourselves a new book.